Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Feet podcast. My name is Pete and I'm joined by my co-host Karen.
Hello.
And today we're really happy, really delighted to have Sara Stevenson with us. Hi, Sara.
Hello both. Great to be with you today.
How's your morning going, Sarah? Because we've got a lot to cover today. We've got a big topic to dive into, which is science and faith. Like, are you ready?
Really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for so much for having me with you. And my morning is going well, so hopefully this conversation goes well as well.
I'm sure, Sarah, you are ready. I think more of the questions is where we're ready, Karen, because I think we were reflecting beforehand how neither of us are any good at science. So if you're listening to this podcast and thinking, I'm not wired this way, we're in company with you.
But we're keen, we're ready, we're open-hearted. I'm pumped. So, Sarah, you're a speaker that's often found traveling about events and universities. You're engaging people around life's big questions. I love that. If producer Claire is correct, she always is. But you've got several degrees, which is impressive. But one in particular, you spent 2 years studying philosophy of science and religion. Can you explain a little bit about your journey to faith and why this topic means so much to you?
So for me, growing up in Northern Ireland, I did have a Christian upbringing. I was brought to church regularly. And then when I went to high school, some of my friends wanted to go to the Christian Union. At that stage, I wasn't particularly interested, I have to clarify. But then having those friends did draw me into the Christian faith. And so part of the issue was I still didn't know how to distinguish between the Christianity that's about being right and having arguments versus really knowing Jesus and showing the love of God in my own life and towards other people. So when I went to university, I was studying a religious studies degree. And part of that is exploring different religions, different worldviews, different perspectives and questions, philosophy. And the new atheist movement were all of the rage at that particular time. So Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, if you've heard of that book. And so I was starting to read these materials and just thinking that this sounded so much more intellectual. The Christian faith that I knew growing up didn't seem in any way to match what I was now studying. But the other side of it is when you go to university, you know that does bring other changes. You know, you're leaving family home, you're making new friends. So it was that mixed motivation of wanting to be free, wanting to explore life. I did part of my undergraduate degree in Hong Kong, as well as reading The New Atheists. And so all in all, that led to a deconstruction of faith. But I realized that we're not here just to talk about my story. So just to summarize that conclusion, it was a journey between realizing that Christian theism had a much more robust response than what I'd realized. And that would be one journey. And the other journey that needed to happen, that had never quite happened, was really discovering Jesus and what this life is truly about. And when those two things came together, then it led to this transformation.
Wow. So good to hear that story. Yeah, I guess for many of us, we have friends who aren't Christians and who maybe for some of them are open to talking about faith and God, but there will be some, and I've definitely got friends like this who just are completely closed to the idea of God because similar to what you were just sharing in your story there, they just think, you know, that science and faith are just a complete odds with each other. Why do you think that kind of attitude, that mindset is so prevalent in our culture? Why do people think that way?
This is going to sound like a strange story, but I think it really is an analogy that helps to make sense of it. So a couple of years ago in Lincolnshire, there was a yoga class happening with a particular teacher, a young one. She had 7 students. And when dog walkers were walking up to the window, when they were looking in through the window, all they could see was 7 bodies on the ground, you know, a yoga teacher that didn't look like a yoga teacher, but looked really creepy. And they walk away from the window thinking this is mass murder. They call the police arrive, and they realize
Wow.
this is a really innocent yoga class taking place. And I think it is a little bit like the conflict thesis in science and religion, where unfortunately the surface level story is the one that gravitates in media. It's a prevalent worldview that gets a lot of soundbite time. And sometimes the reality of what's really going on never fully comes to the surface. And I think it's a little bit like that story where people think mass murder, these are two subjects, two disciplines that cannot coincide, when actually they haven't buried deeper into the story to see what else is going on. What other ways are there of looking at this? And that's where the conversation needs to go, is beyond the surface.
Oh, God bless the dog walkers.
Yeah.
I've got so many thoughts on dog walkers and finding bodies, but it's not the time.
I might also need to
Sarah,
call the police before we exit the podcast here.
I don't have a dog. I feel that that's really important to say just at this moment. Right. Sarah, Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravitation, or gravity, and used it as a reason for belief in God. But on the other side, Professor Stephen Hawking, instead took it as a reason for doing away with the notion of God. So what role does science play when it comes to thinking about the big questions in life, do you reckon?
So to your first point, science grew out of a Christian culture, because the idea of an ultimate God with classic attributes of powerfulness and goodness, these kinds of characteristics, and how the universe holds together underneath that kind of God, makes sense that therefore would be rationality to the universe. So in other words, as per your Isaac Newton example, we can assume that there would be that kind of rationality to the universe to explore it. So Christianity was very much in complementarity to that kind of scientific investigation. So how have we then shifted from science emerging from Christian cultures? And just to clarify, that's not the case in polytheistic cultures or non-religious cultures. Science.
Just jump in. What do you mean by polytheistic cultures?
Yeah, so if your worldview is that there isn't that kind of God as the fundamental intelligence behind the reality, you don't tend to look at the universe in that empirical, rational way. You think that there's other principles that can govern the world. So it is quite strange that non-Christian cultures don't have a scientific outlook. They don't think that those are the fundamental answers to life.
I see.
So how did we then emerge into a conflict thesis? Well, those words originated from the 19th century. And basically the viewpoint was, well, if science, broadly speaking, is investigative, it's empirical, you're trying to find evidence and answers and hypotheses and have trial and error and let the conclusions speak for themselves, well, how could that journey alongside religion, which, again, broadly speaking, tends to be beliefs and patterns and community worship that's conclusive? It's, in their view, to the conflict thesis, dogmatic. And so for the first time in history from the 19th century, we demarcated these two disciplines as if they were separate bodies of information. But historically, that's never how we viewed the world. We always thought that there was different disciplines and different bodies of knowledge that could come together and give us a whole understanding of something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the challenging thing for us then, from what you're saying, is that the discipline of science and faith haven't always been at these polar opposites. That's, if I'm understanding you right, there's not always been the case that it's being science versus God. That's actually quite a new concept. And obviously Newton, and there's lots of famous scientists in history who had a Christian faith. So that distance between the two is quite a new thing to almost pitch them against each other. Is that the essence there of what you're saying?
Absolutely the essence, because in the 19th century, it was basically seen as, well, if this is going to progress, we would now need to start to attack this in order for one. So one example of that is the Galileo case. Obviously, we know that he was challenging the outlook of the solar system to be different to what it was assumed under Aristotle. And so because the church wanted to be careful around what Galileo was proclaiming, he does become under house arrest. He does get arrested. And therefore, those in the conflict thesis would say, well, this is a prime example. Here you have a scientist being persecuted by the church. These are two bodies that could never cohere. But the reality behind that example is that everyone in the world had assumed the same beliefs about the solar system, that it was geocentric, that we're at the center of it all. That wasn't a church versus secular in the way that we think of society today. It's a very different world.
Sure.
And the other thing about Galileo's arrest is he was one of those people that, if you can imagine someone who is problematic in your class, always opinionated, but doing it in a way that will rile everyone. Because one of the ways he wrote about this was to mock the opposite view. It was also at a time in political history when Catholicism and Protestantism were having other factions. And so he was seen as another kind of danger to society in the same way as that split was happening within the church. This is to say that the conflict thesis loves to take these kind of examples and say, look at this, they can't cohere. Whereas if you dig under the surface, it's not really science versus religion. It's usually multifactorial that helps to get to the bottom of it.
No, that's really helpful. So what about for the Christian young person who's listening to this and who is chatting to their friends at school or college? And actually, I mean, I know this happens for me as well in other contexts. It's not just particular to school or college. And you tell somebody you're a Christian and you get that almost throwaway kind of comment of, oh yeah, and I don't believe in that stuff, I prefer to believe in fact, or hasn't science disproved God? And some of these almost little sound bites that you get in that moment. What would be a good response to that for a Christian person who isn't able to maybe articulate all of that history or in the way that you've just done, which is really encouraging, really helpful for us to hear? But what's a good response when that attitude or even just that line comes out, do you think?
I think there's 3 key words that I would bear in mind. One is the word worldview. So remember, when you're facing an opposition, science is not something that's embodied. Science is a discipline open to interpretation by the worldview of the scientist. So when you have someone that is opposing you, think about the fact that they have a worldview in the same way as you have a worldview. So they might, for instance, be a naturalist. What that means is they have come to the belief that there are only natural things in the universe, that there are no supernatural answers. Quite often in this theme, what becomes relevant about that worldview is this belief in scientism. So scientism is the view that science is the only way to truth. But remember, there is nothing in science that would lead to that conclusion. There is no experiment that will get you there. In fact, if you were to write that on your whiteboard in school, you'd need a variety of other things that are non-scientific, even to construct the sentence. So there is nothing provable about scientism. That is merely the viewpoint of the person that is opposing you. The second key word that I think is really helpful is to remember that there needs to be an agency behind all things. Now, what do I mean by agency? What I mean by agency is something that has mind and intelligence is needed for all of the causality that's within the universe. So I'll give you an example. If you are a football fan, there is a lot of controversy around VAR, as we know, VAR, in the Premier League. And it's interesting because we're now living in a generation whereby science has now met football. We can bring technology and cameras to the game. We can capture every single moment in the game with multiple angles. And yet we've never had more differences in opinion in terms of the referee's decisions. Why is that the case? Because science still needs agency. The referee's mind still needs to interpret the data. And by analogy, that is the same as your universe. Yes, there are natural laws and processes, but there still needs to be a mind and intelligence to bring those things to be. And then the third key word to bear in mind is complementarity. And that's the view that everything within the universe, it's complementary to view God and science as two things that can cohere. So what's an example for that? Well, if you take the fine-tuning of the universe as an example, we've gone a long way from when William Paley picked up a watch and thought, well, look at all of the features of the watch. It looks designed. There must be a watchmaker. We have only become much more convinced of fine-tuning in the universe. And that's to say that there are multiple constants that are needed in order for life to be here on Earth. And so it's not just that atheism or naturalism has all of science on their side, and we as Christians stand over here and we just pray. No, if we actually take a step back and look at the universe, then we can see scientific examples of why we would need to have God as the intelligence and mind behind it all.
So when Claire Williams, who is a colleague of yours, came on as a guest, she said, and I'm quoting, if God exists, we should see his fingerprints on the world. From science, from history, from philosophy, mathematics, ethics, morality. All this creates a bigger picture of God's hand or evidence in the world. Like, what a quote. She must be great to work with. Is there anything that you point people to help people see God's fingerprints on the world?
Hi, Claire, if you're listening. Good to hear of you. I think a little bit like what Claire has previously said, I do think it is a cumulative, what we would call that approach is the cumulative case for Christianity. And that is whereby there's no one argument that operates as absolute proof that this is definitely the conclusion. But I think it's more that what we call in philosophy is abductive reasoning. That sounds fancy. All it means is you are like Sherlock Holmes trying to gather the information to the best inference or to the best conclusion. What makes sense of the evidence? So for Sherlock Holmes, he's looking at, right, well, here's the body, here's the crime scene, here's the people, and he's trying to get to the conclusion of who the most likely killer is. And I think that is a wonderful way to approach the evidence. He's almost like that detective. What makes sense that the universe really is here? Why is it finely tuned? Why are we human beings with purpose and meaning, and we're moral creatures? We self-sacrifice. It's not just in our interests. Why are we these kinds of beings? Why are we spiritually searching creatures? And I think when you take a step back cumulatively, these things do amount to evidence beyond reasonable belief that there is a God.
Okay. So you need to bring Sherlock Holmes to the yoga place. Is sort of what I'm putting it all together. And back to bodies we go.
Yes and no, because I think we do want to clarify that you do not need to be the philosopher of philosophers to conclude that there is a God. Christianity has always been a really simple thing. You can simply reach out and know God. Spiritually, he's accessible. But it is just to say, if you want to go down the investigative route, Christianity is not anti-intellectual. It is very rational, and the evidence is there.
What would you say, Sarah, to some of our listeners who are maybe studying things like science, A-level or at school, or maybe other subjects that might kind of delve into some of these topics as well, and are maybe can feel quite rocked in that place? It can be hard. We get feedback from some of our listeners and students who we support that sometimes if they've got a very strong atheist as a teacher who's very disparaging of Christianity or other classmates, and that can feel like quite a hostile environment. It can make some Christian students feel a bit wobbly when the whole room is very disparaging of Christianity or is very much pushing a certain viewpoint across. How would you encourage a student who's in that environment? What would you say?
Well, I would say that primarily the A-level content isn't the fundamental questions of life and is there a God and isn't there a God? Like most of what you're studying will be, you're going to have all worldviews in the room and you're all going to be studying it together. And that won't be a conflict between all of you because you're studying, the processes of how things work. So that's just to say, be wise. Don't create conflict where there isn't any and just assume that you're a victim. So that's maybe one extreme.
Yeah.
The
helpful.
other extreme obviously can be that kind of experience where you're not the one looking for trouble, and it may well be the teacher or someone else that wants to make an issue of everything. And I would just say that you can imagine the pressure that Claire and I feel as evangelists, that if people read our job description, you'd think, well, there's lots of non-Christians in England. So, the pressure's on. So you have to operate in life with the posture of relying on God. So that means it's not your job to save the classroom. It's not your job to save the teacher or your classmate. That's God's job. Okay. He is the one that spiritually and supernaturally brings new life. And so your job, if you are a Christian in the classroom, is to get into his presence, to be filled with him. And yes, there will be opportunities to speak in his name to your friends or to defend him should you be attacked. But you do that in the submissiveness of the God who is before you, and it is about him. So again, just draw in his strength as you do that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think it can feel that pressure, can't it? Sometimes that, oh, I have to defend God. I have to give the answer here for God. And actually God doesn't need us to defend him. He's more than able to reveal himself, isn't he? And I think that can be a real encouragement for students in that situation. Of sometimes we don't have to give an answer. There are moments where Jesus just stayed silent, or Jesus just asked a question and didn't bring an answer. And I guess outworking that in a classroom environment when we feel under attack, or in a common room or amongst friends, can be really important, can't it?
There's only one savior. He walked in the first century, and no offense to ourselves on this podcast, or if you're listening, it ain't us. But it is just fascinating that in the Old Testament, the presence of God was in a place. That the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. There was so much of God's glory, and that they would tie the ankle of the high priest to make sure he didn't die in the presence of God, that they could then bring him out again.
Yeah.
And yet in the New Testament, Jesus is the Son of God. When he's speaking to the religious leaders, he's saying, in 3 days, this temple will be raised, meaning I am now the walking temple. Jesus is the temple of God. And yet to the Christian, the Apostle Paul now explains in Corinthians, you are now the temple of God because God's Spirit dwells within you. And so it is this holy mystery of everywhere where you walk in your skill, you're bringing the presence of God. And yet we do it with humility because it's still the power of the Spirit that works beyond you into changing the world around you. And so I think that's balancing a confidence with a humility for what it is to be a Christian.
That's so good. Yeah.
Such wisdom. I want some more. So many people we have spoken to on this podcast comment on the importance of listening well and engaging with our friends where they are at. So my question is, have you got any wisdom on how we can guide people from, when you're having those big whopping conversations about huge things, about the origins of the universe and science and blah, blah, and you're talking big talk, how do we go from there to the person of Jesus? Because that Jesus you're talking about, like that's the important thing we want to get our friends to, isn't it? It's massive, isn't it? The Christian claim isn't just that there is a creator out there, but the one who made everything came down, as Colossians puts it, holds all things together. So we want to be pointing our friends to Jesus. How do we go from big debate with our mates to Jesus, here is Jesus? That was a long way of asking a question.
Not at all.
I got a bit into it.
And obviously this question could be the podcast because there's so many nuances to it.
Of course, yeah.
But what I would say is that friendship with people is never a soundbite. Right? People have the attention span where they want to go on social media and see a quick response to something and they'll be able to dissect truth. And friendship doesn't work that way. And it takes time and it is a process. So your conversations with your non-Christian friend could be quite generic in the beginning. It could be nothing to do with Jesus specifically. It might be other things like dealing with, well, how could I know there's a God at all? Or how could that God exist alongside suffering? Or in this generic sense of science and religion. But over time in friendship, then that can then develop and transition into more specific conversations. So the first thing is to say, it's not a soundbite. This is a person, and it is a journey of getting them into a particular place to talk about Jesus. I think the other thing to say about that is you don't have to be an expert in those big questions in order to earn the right to talk about Jesus. So maybe just a couple of pieces of advice around that. It may well be that a friend is going up to you and saying, I have these questions in science, and you know that you're not the person to answer that. And that's okay. You don't have to be. But if they keep going to you and asking the same question, what your responsibility could be is to locate resources that could help them. So that maybe is turning them to something like Reboot Questions. So that's our Youth Apologetics channel on social media and YouTube. Or it could be turning them to someone like Professor John Lennox. He's written an accessible book on science and religion called Can Science Explain Everything? And so you're pointing them to the resources that can help to move that conversation on. And then the final piece of advice is none of us are experts in everything. Our primary testimony is always our personal story. You know Jesus. That is your story. And that is always going to play itself out in conversation. If you're simply honest about who you are, where you go, what you do, it cannot help but to land in a specific conversation about Jesus. And I often think the starting point for that isn't out of fear. I'm a Christian, I better try to talk to however many people about God. Your primary or fundamental beginning to that journey is, I'm going to spend time with Jesus, loving him, so that I can't help but to talk about him. That controller is love. When you love God, you start to talk about the things that you love, and that will happen in quite natural ways.
I mean, I think that's a brilliant place to land. We're probably out of time, and I think that's a fantastic place to land with what you've shared there. And we had a story recently of a student in our network who we support was just sharing a little bit about a friend who they talked to who seems very atheistic and is asking these tough questions about science. And then they were really shocked one day when this friend said to them that they've actually sometimes pick up the Bible and they read it because they find it comforting. and I think that just illustrates really clearly there is the intellectual part is important. We are called to seek to try and give an answer where we can, or certainly signpost people to the answers where we can, like you were sharing, Sarah. But actually, God meets people in their hearts. And even though this non-Christian, maybe atheist friend of this Christian student had a lot of strong opinions intellectually about Christianity, there was still something about the Bible, something about God that in their hearts that they were drawn to. And I think that can be such an encouragement for many of us who are listening, who may be thinking about that friend at school or college who has maybe watched a lot of YouTube or has quite a much better scientific knowledge and can like bring out these one-liners and these arguments, and we just feel really flummoxed and really on the back foot in that moment. But actually, we just don't know what God is doing in people's hearts. I guess just to finish, Sarah, for those listening who are thinking, yeah, maybe I'm not going to pursue a career in science or in apologetics, which is the posh word for what you do, which is looking at the kind of evidence around Christianity and giving an answer for that. But for those who just like, actually, I'd love to just be a bit better equipped to have those conversations when somebody says, "Oh, hasn't science disproved God?" Or do you know what I mean? Like, I'd love to just be a bit better resourced with some little answers, some things, some illustrations, some stuff that I can bring out that can just maybe start to remove that barrier. And often that's what we're doing, aren't we? We're just trying to remove some of those intellectual barriers that exist for people. So that their hearts can be more open. What would be some things that you would point them to, whether that be books or YouTube channels or resources? You mentioned one a minute ago, but maybe if you could just summarize a few to finish, that would be great.
Yeah, so the podcast world is highly resourced in these kinds of conversations. So Premier Christian Radio, they run an apologetics podcast called The Unbelievable Show. So the idea behind that is you have a theist in conversation with someone of another worldview discussing a big question. And what I would say is, particularly if you're going on to study A-level religious studies or philosophy or ethics, lots of those questions will be really, really helpful for the material that you're studying. You've got Christians who are also in the podcast space. So you've got people like Glenn Scrivener, who was an ordained minister in the Christian church, but yet loves these big questions like we do today. And so he's got a podcast channel. Again, he'll be addressing some of these kinds of questions. In terms of the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics that I represent, we have a YouTube channel in which we try to bring lots of guests onto that have particular expertises. Reboot Questions, as I've mentioned, is our youth apologetics channel. You're going to see a bunch of stuff on social media and YouTube there. I've already mentioned John Lennox's books. People like him and Alistair McGrath have always been at the front line of defending the Christian faith here in England. And I think another resource, maybe just to finish with, is an American speaker who's trying to bridge between culture and the church is someone called Paul Copan. So he's written a book called Origins, and in that, he's trying to bring these lenses of science and religion to the book of Genesis to give particular perspectives in there that I think is quite helpful.
That's great. Well, there's plenty there for people to crack into if they want to. And I know we've done bits of stuff with Reboot in the past. I've been to some Reboot events and I highly recommend them. They're fantastic spaces and often really helpful in giving you those little bits of things that you can say or that confidence sometimes to try and have those conversations.
And just to also mention, Sharon Dirckx is a neuroscientist. She's done her PhD in that area of focus. So she's got a book, Am I Just My Brain, which is very much the intersection of science and religion. So do check out her stuff. She is a scientist. She loves the big questions. And Amy Orr Ewing has written many books and resources. Do check her stuff out. She's got a book called But Is It Real?, which does look at, I think, around 10 objections and gives some areas for you to think about in the big questions.
Brilliant. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. I'm very aware we've very much just scratched the surface of a huge topic, but hopefully for some of our listeners, it's maybe whet their appetite for some of the stuff that's out there that they can dig into. Hopefully for many of our listeners as well, it's given them a bit more confidence in those moments and in those places. We can just be continuing to pray, can't we, for our non-Christian friends, that the barriers, that the things that get in the way of them really opening their hearts to Jesus would be removed. And that's just always a great prayer to pray, isn't it, as well? So thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to hopefully chatting to you again at some point soon. God bless.
Thank you both.